You see kind of what I'm doing here. I'm actually saying in different words what this report says about measure and calculate and so forth, but I'm trying to put it in a phrase, national ecological accounts, because if you're a political guy and you got to get it into the 10 seconds to get on the news. That's the hook. We need national ecological accounts. And then the interviewer says, what's the national ecological accounts? And then you get to say more. But if you don't get the hook at the front end, you don't get into that conversation, or you just turn them off. Now, a second step, which I think ought to appear at various points along any roadmap to national environmental sustainability, involves the harnessing of science to the goal of sustainability. In particular, I think we should work towards creating an environmental equivalent of the Geological Survey of Canada, creating the Ecological and Biodiversity Survey of Canada. And let me explain what I mean here. Recently, both the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown and newly elected U.S. President Barack Obama gave major speeches on harnessing science to the national goals of their country. Brown's was an hour-long, brilliant address at Oxford. I don't agree with Gordon Brown on a lot of things, but you've got to concede it was a brilliant address. And Obama's was almost 45-minute address as well. And both of them noted that their oldest and most prestigious scientific establishments had their beginnings in a time of civil war. The Royal Society, which is the oldest scientific establishment in Britain, was actually created during the English Civil War. And the National Academy of Science in the United States was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. In other words, there's a little implication here that one of the first harnessing of science by national governments to a national objective was connected to war. Now, as a Canadian, I think it's significant and worth recalling that the initial organization of science in our country and harnessing it to public objectives had a very different origin and thrust. A generation before Confederation was put together, the leaders and people of the British North American colonies launched a scientific endeavor which was to contribute as much to the building of Canada as the BNA Act and the Canadian Pacific Railway. And it was called, what was it called? The Geological Survey of Canada. And it began with a 1,500-pound grant from the legislatures of the United Colony of Canada to carry out a geological survey of its territory. After Confederation in 1867, the Geological Survey of Canada was expanded to become the principal scientific-based endeavor of the new federal government, and its personnel methodically surveyed and catalogued the minerals, soil, climate, water, and forests of Canada, the material base of the Canadian economy, and the first scientific description of our country. So I ask, what is the environmental equivalent of the Geological Survey of Canada? Where is the ecological equivalent of the Geological Survey of Canada? What we need is some formally organized and supported ecological and biodiversity survey of Canada. And organized in a way that people recognize this is something we're doing, this is something we're investing money in, this is something we're going to do every year, this is something we're going to report on every year. Like the Geological Survey of Canada, people were doing geological surveys, finding out how much, where the forests were, where the water was, all this. People were doing all of this before that was formally surveyed. But it didn't get into the public consciousness or the political consciousness decision-making until it was organized as this Geological Survey of Canada with a name and an organization and a regular mandate. And I guess what I'm saying then is that Ecological and Biodiversity Survey of Canada, formalized and organized like that, ought to occupy a prominent place on the roadmap to sustainability. Is there some moving going on back there? Okay. I'm used to political meetings where hecklers try to disturb the meeting, so I'm suspicious. Anyway, they're taking care of it. So, okay, now there's another form of study and assessment, one that draws more on the social sciences and humanities than on the physical or life sciences, which can also help us along this road to environmental sustainability, mainly by preventing us from making wrong turns or steering into the ditch. And I refer now to the performance of what are called EEELS surveys. And some of you are familiar with these. These are environmental, economic, ethical, legal, and social impact surveys that are done when you're thinking of applying a new technology. You should do an EEELS assessment. What is its economic, environmental, ethical, legal, and social implications? Questions which sometimes the scientists themselves don't always ask because they're working on how to make this thing work. The necessity of these kind of studies was first appreciated by governments, especially the U.S. government, after the Second World War, when sober second thought was given to how the development and application of nuclear science had progressed. While the peaceful use of nuclear technology offered significant benefits to mankind, there was, of course, a dark side to that technology, represented ultimately by atom bombs and hydrogen bombs. This dark side, in particular the negative environmental, social, and ethical effects of the application of nuclear energy, was never fully understood and investigated at the time that technology was developed. Because it was developed between the two wars and before the wars. This was all done afterwards. And the conclusion of people that looked at that was that in the future, such studies should be conducted in parallel with the development of new science and technologies. And that's exactly what's happened with the Human Genome Project and the genetic engineering techniques that are associated with that. The Human Genome Project, there was a specific commitment made to invest 10% of that research budget in examining the economic, environmental, ethical, legal, and social consequences of this new technology. Now, science and technology, I think we all agree, can play an enormously important role in reducing and eliminating the negative environmental impacts of economic activity. But there are also dangers and unanticipated consequences that can arise from embracing any new science and technology, including the ones used to try to fix the environment. The negative impacts on world food supplies, for example, arising from the increased production of ethanol from biomass as a substitute for petroleum-based fuel, is a perfect example of that. So, of course, let's harness science and technology to the task of sustainability. But let's also be sure to investigate the unanticipated consequences, the potential dark side of new technologies, to do the economic, environmental, ethical, legal, and social analyses of new technologies to make sure that the benefits outweigh the harms. And so I put the EEELS studies as another point on our roadmap. And particularly whenever you talk about applying science and technology to solve a problem, I add the EEELS component. Now let me hasten to add, by borrowing an analogy from the Calgary Stampede, that science and technology and EELS studies are not the only horses that can and should be harnessed to the sustainability chuck wagon. Enlightened government, this is a Western analogy, enlightened government regulation is another horse that can be harnessed to that objective, and grassroots democratic energy is another horse that can be harnessed to that. And I want to discuss both of those in a moment. But let me briefly mention one other largely untapped source of wisdom and energy for supporting and achieving environmental stewardship that is too often ignored, particularly by secular decision makers. Let me ask you this question. What cultural traditions in the Western world have had a concept of stewardship in their folklore, in their writings, and in their teachings for thousands of years?